All right, joining me today is the Athletics' John Mackenzie and also founder of photography platform Pickfair and long-suffering West Ham fan Benji Lanyado as well. Benji, we have to go to you on this one to start with. And I apologize because the last time you were here, I think we were talking about how disastrous it was under David Moyes, and we're coming in talking about West Ham. And I was hoping we'd have some much more positive news based on the beginning campaign of the Premier League. But from your perspective, from a Lopetegui perspective as well, what are his biggest issues right now?
He just hasn't had much time. I think that's probably like the boring caveat we have to put on all of our discussions about West Ham at the moment. Like,
Mm.
there's a big turnover of players, right? It was possible that seven of our 11, including the summer signings, could be brand new, and we signed a lot of those quite late. And the issue actually is that Lopetegui is still experimenting in real time, which is sort of a bit dangerous, and it's been exposed. It feels uncomfortable. Um, but we perhaps expected a little bit more structure, a little bit more identity. Yes, we're 5 games in, but this is a very, very experienced manager. It's not like he's a Fabian Hertzler or even
Mm.
someone like Enzo Maresca who's learning slightly on the job early on, and he's managed in the Premier League before. I think that's pretty critical. So I think West Ham fans are it's understandable if they were expecting a little bit more at this stage, but ultimately it's very early on, and we're going to need to give West Ham some time.
Yeah, John, look, they've lost their first three home games in a campaign, and incoming managers, that's not a good start if you want to try and get fans on board. But, I don't know. I've looked at Lopetegui's history defensively. That's usually how his structures really emanate from, the really solid defensive blocks. They haven't shown a great defense or a great attack on the pitch. On a tactical level, where hasn't it clicked for West Ham?
Yeah, I feel like I'm being thrown under the bus here. I'm immediately being asked where it's all going wrong. But yeah, as you mentioned, Lopetegui, a manager who I think was brought in to, in part due to his
Mm.
strengths defensively. And the game against Chelsea at the weekend was one of the worst defensive performances I think I can remember in the last 5 years from a team from an out of possession perspective. So,
Mm.
really, really worrying stuff. I think the obviously we need to talk a little bit about what West Ham are trying to do by bringing someone like Lopetegui in, right? There's the idea there is that what they want to do is introduce a new tactical style of play, which should, in theory, raise the ceiling from what was there before. What we've got with West Ham is a really fantastic squad of players who can play quote unquote possession based football. And so what the West Ham fans, what the West Ham board will be wanting to see is that sort of translating onto the field. But so far, what we've seen is, I think, sort of worrying signs. I think there has been some good stuff. Like I do think that West Ham are better in terms of starting off build-ups, moving the ball down the field. When it's come to the final third, that hasn't translated into generating better chances. I saw that West Ham are in the bottom five teams in terms of chance creation this season,
Mm.
which is a worrying stat. They're also in the bottom five, or the top five, I should say, for chances conceded per xG as well. So that's worrying as well. So there are some shoots there for that. There are ideas in possession that could maybe be translated into something better further down the line. But I do think that the out of possession stuff for me has been the most worrying so far because, as we said, Lopetegui was brought in part to fix an ailing defence, and if he's going to play the way that he played against Chelsea, and I understand that that's a one-off game, and Chelsea
Mm.
have quite a lot of flexibility in terms of how they structure themselves, but at the same time, Chelsea do the same thing, relatively speaking, in possession in their structure, and it seemed as though Lopetegui was sort of broadsided by it a little bit. He was surprised that they have Cucurella inverting inside. Didn't seem
Mm.
to know how to. Lopetegui didn't seem to know how to cover that, and those sorts of things seem to me to be basic enough that if you can't get them right now, it does raise questions about what's going to happen going forward. So yeah, I think big questions about how you fix this. And at the moment, yes, you want to give him time, but at the moment, the signs are that things are heading in the wrong direction rather than in the right direction.
Yeah, I'd always caveat a lot of this with the fact that, it's still early on in the season and, you know, players are still coming back properly into fitness and all that kind of stuff. But I guess Lopetegui's also had a bit of Premier League experience, which is something that's crossing my mind at this moment in time. But Benji, we'll talk about the new signings in just a second. But West Ham still have Jared Bowen. They still have Mohamed Kudus. They still have Lucas Paquetá. Do you think by watching West Ham right now, Lopetegui has a sense of his starting 11, or indeed the kind of formation he wants to play with at West Ham?
No, and I think he's learning. I mean, the thing that's a bit unfortunate is he's learning the things that Moyes learned last season. He's having to sort of relearn them ultimately. Like there's this, it's really unfortunate that our two best players in Kudus and Paquetá both want to play in the same position on the right. And we're kind of like trying to solve that puzzle by moving Bowen into the middle where he's perfectly good. I mean, he's such a good player. You can put him more or less anywhere and he'll perform. But ideally, I think we'd have an upgrade on Antonio through the middle, which I think is what we were hoping we were getting with Füllkrug. But in his in his early performances, we haven't quite seen enough of him to suggest that he can really do that role, i.e. be an Antonio upgrade. And I think there's also the slight problem of ultimately this system that he's looking to play relies quite heavily on fullbacks. And we bought Aaron Wan-Bissaka. Now, the kind of, the trope about Aaron Wan-Bissaka is great one-on-one defender, not particularly good going forward. Well, we kind of had that with Vladimir Coufal as well, just an older version, right? And lo and behold, what have we seen of Wan-Bissaka so far? He's good one-on-one as a defender if he's in the right position. This system takes him slightly out of position, but he's not amazingly creative going forward. And I guess also if he's hugging the touchline, it makes a lot more sense if he's going up and down. Emerson Palmieri on the other side is pretty good at that. What we saw at Chelsea, which is really weird, was Wan-Bissaka kind of ending up almost as a false nine at times. Like, get up the pitch, sure, but do that to provide width, not becoming a kind of, a kind of pseudo centre forward. So the short answer, Io, is no, he really does not know his best lineup right now. He hooked Guido Rodriguez at about 40 minutes at the weekend. And actually, to some extent in these early games, he's been hanging his hat on Guido Rodriguez as this kind of midfield destroyer. He's the one that should be able to pick up the ball and distribute it quickly when you're out of position, when you've had an attack foiled, right? And then some weird stuff like Edson Alvarez as a kind of sweeper. That doesn't make any sense at all. Like that doesn't, it's not logical. He actually is a really good destroyer, tackler, interceptor, good on the ball. What he is not is fast. And you're putting him up against Jackson, who I think is deceptively fast. And of course, he destroyed him, right? So yeah, there are question marks all over the pitch. Where's Jared Bowen's best position? Can you get Kudus to play on the left when he's never really played on the left? And his decision-making is still questionable. And it's even more questionable when he's in an uncomfortable position, right? What is Paquetá's role? Should he be solely kind of focused on the attack, or should he be grafting in midfield as well? Like, there's a lot going on there, but we have got the raw materials, and I guess I'm perhaps naively reserving a bit of faith in Lopetegui. He's got the track record. He's done it in the Premier League before. We've got the assets. I just think you've got to give it a bit of time. Remember Iraola's start at Bournemouth, right? Everyone after 4 or 5 games was saying, this guy looks like a sort of, substitute teacher. What's he doing in the Premier League trying to play expansive football at Bournemouth? And then, 10, 15 games in, it started to click. And the games we've lost so far, Villa at home, Champions League Villa, Man City, right? Chelsea, £2 billion worth of quality. Last year, we got hammered away at Fulham. I think it was 4-0. We got an undeserved draw this time around. We got hammered at Palace. I think it was 5-2. We beat them.
Keep dropping puns in there, mate. Come on, keep going.
Anyway, so, it's not as worrying as I think people are making out, and we've got the raw materials there.
Just very quickly, I do think that, especially with West Ham fans at that match in particular against Chelsea, there felt like a lot of dismay, and fans were leaving, I think, with like 20 odd minutes to go. I mean, that is huge for me. And Jared Bowen also said, and you mentioned Bowen earlier, this was schoolboy in a post-match interview, the way they conceded some of those goals. I mean, hearing that, is the fans' frustration at the style of football, the management, or the desire that the players didn't show?
I think I remember on a previous podcast we talked about this oscillating graph of West Ham managerial sexiness, right? So we're gonna start with Allardyce, not so
Yeah.
sexy, and then Bilic, bit sexier, then Moyes, not so sexy, then Pellegrini, sexier, then Moyes again, right?
Moyes.
And so I think the expectation is that what would come next is a bit sexier. And because and people sort of thought, okay, Julen Lopetegui, he's a another Basque manager. He's managed Spain and won cups with Sevilla, but he is not a sexy manager. Never has been. He as John was alluding to, he's known for his building a team on defensive structure. So I think first of all, there's a mismatch between the expectation and what Lopetegui actually is, and also if he's supposed to be a guy that like makes you solid in defence and then builds forward. Well, that's sort of what David Moyes was good at as well. So I think that ultimately fans are impatient. They're always impatient. But if you're gonna bin off, statistically your best manager of all time, the guy that's won you a European trophy, I think you'd be expecting something more exciting and interesting, or at least encouraging fairly quickly. And we're not seeing that. And of course, they're impatient. But I don't think no sane West Ham fan is like calling for his head yet. Put it that way.
Okay. John, earlier, Benji mentioned Iraola and how long it took him to implement his ideas at Bournemouth. In fairness to Bournemouth and West Ham, I'd like to think West Ham are shooting a little higher than where Bournemouth are right now. But, how long should it take for someone to implement those ideas on their team? And this isn't someone who doesn't know about the top flight either. This is someone who's won the Europa League, let's not forget. Should we just give him more time?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question because the implication is that all managers should be given more time. And the question is, well, some of those managers eventually they decide, well, they shouldn't be given more time. They haven't shown that they have what it takes in order to justify that. And I guess at this point in time, the question is, how do you know whether or not Lopetegui is heading in the right direction? There's plenty of managers. You mentioned Iraola, where you do see that eventual uptick. We've seen plenty of managers come in this season and have a much quicker uptick than Lopetegui. So Arne Slot is doing really well at Liverpool this season. Fabian Herzl are doing really well at Brighton. What's the difference between West Ham and those two clubs? Well, those two clubs have a very clear identity, a tactical identity, but also a club philosophy about how their club should be run and what that looks like on the field, the sorts of players they should be bringing in, the sorts of managers they should be bringing in. And those clubs generally are developed on a director of football model. And the idea being the director of football builds a squad, brings in the manager, and he's responsible or she's responsible for whatever takes place on the field. Now, West Ham, they do have a director of football, but it's interesting hearing Benji talking about the timeline of West Ham sexiness, because when they brought in Pellegrini, the owners at West Ham brought in a director of football at that time as well. It's not just the case that bringing in a director of football necessarily fixes things, as it didn't at that period. And the question is now, what's the relationship between the director of football at West Ham, the ownership board, the recruitment department, and the coaching staff as well? Because from what it looks like to me on the outside, there's a lot of actors and players there with competing interests, and that has worked itself out in, for example, the transfer window. So we saw a situation where, on the one hand, it was going to be Aaron Wan-Bissaka being brought in. On the other hand, it was going to be Nusayr Mazraoui, who's ended up at Manchester United. Those are two very, very different profiles of fullback. That to me suggests that there's competing interests going on behind the scenes there as well. So for me, the question of how much time you should be giving to someone like Lopetegui, it does depend on these sorts of questions, because with Liverpool, with Brighton, they brought in managers who are continuations of previous managers. They have the same sort of tactical ideas. They have, they can use the same squad. The squad has been built in such a way that it doesn't take, 5, 6, 7 big signings to get the squad in line with where the manager is at. And all of that makes it much more likely that you will then translate one manager into the other with a minimum of fuss. Now, West Ham are in a different situation, obviously, because they're trying to make a switch. But the problem is, going back to Benji's timeline of sexiness, is that with West Ham, you don't have that through line. It's one manager does this, and it sometimes seems to me that the ownership at West Ham are like, well, fine, everyone wants us to have a more, a foreign cool manager, so we'll bring one in. we set them up almost to fail, it seems. They
Mm.
fail, and then they say, well, we gave you what you wanted and it was bad, so we're going to go back to your Allardyces, we're going to go back to your Moises. And I think,
Yeah.
for me, that's the issue, is that the question of how much time Lopetegui should be given has to be read against the background of what's going on off the pitch as well.
I
Mm.
think John's point about Mazraoui versus Wan-Bissaka. Look at who we were trying to get before we got Lopetegui. It was Almorin. Um, Again, these are two quite different managers, right? Now, I do think there is an approach that says just try and get the highest quality personnel you possibly can, right? And I think Mazraoui was also trying to speed Man United up in signing him so they could get Wan-Bissaka. They were sort of playing games there a
Mm.
little bit. Um, but I think the other really important point that John made is the remit of Lopetegui versus, for example, Hertzler and Slot, who were ultimately, tasked with more of the same. Keep this
Mm.
kind of like we're not going to transform the playing style. We're not actually going to transform the squad. Look at Liverpool; they barely signed anybody. We just want you to keep kind of gradually iterating upwards. With Lopetegui, it's a big remit, and therefore I think that is why it's a huge amount of turnover in the squad as well, which is why he has to be given more time, because it's bananas to say come into this side with European aspirations. We're getting rid of 10 players. We're bringing in 8. And by the way, we want a completely different playing style, and then sack him after 5 games. Doesn't make sense. They have to give him time.
Okay. Well, let's move on to West Ham's summer business, because West Ham's £122 million summer spree led many to believe that they'd won the window, but it's not quite worked out in reality. So let's get stuck into West Ham's summer signings and see how they've performed so far. Well, here's the Athletics West Ham correspondent, Rashane Thomas.
What a disappointing start to the season for West Ham, considering there's so much optimism in the summer, given the 9 new arrivals, the 120 million investment in the squad. When I think about the signings, the two in particular who started well are Max Kilman and now Wan-Bissaka, but now it's time for the others to step up. You have Lewis Guilherme, who's yet to be involved in a matchday squad. In fact, he's yet to play a single minute for West Ham, and he cost 25.5 million. And then you have Nicholas Füllkrug. He had his first full start against Bournemouth in the Cup, but he suffered injury with Germany on international duty, and he missed the last 2 league games. But even so, when he played against Bournemouth, he wasn't particularly great. So there are question marks on some of the summer arrivals, but look, Loptegeui will hope to turn it around and win the fans over once more. But you have to do so by playing attacking football, which the fans want to see.
We at The Athletic carried out a survey a few weeks back, and 96% of West Ham fans voted that the team is stronger after the transfer window. As Rashane just mentioned, a few names there, especially the standout ones: Max Kilman, Summerville, Füllkrug, Wan-Bissaka, and Tadibo. The list goes on. Look, if you had to run through any of these new signings so far, who would you say has been an instant success? Because some haven't even really had a full debut yet.
Hillman's the one that you ask any West Ham fan, they've been really happy with him so far. He's been caught out a few times in the last few games, but that's arguably been because of mistakes made around him, not his own mistakes. He looks good value at £40 million. And he's a player at the sort of, arguably the prime period of his career. He's 27 years old. Lopetegui's worked with him before, and yeah, it really felt like early on he was a player that made very few mistakes, doesn't go to ground very often, intercepts the ball rather than having to tackle it the whole time, and he's intelligent. So yeah, very, very happy with him. It's actually hard to say any of the rest have been instant hits. We saw Wan-Bissaka do a sort of lovely marauding run and an assist for Bowen in the game versus Crystal Palace. That was really encouraging. Again, he was hugging the touchline rather than coming inside there. It's perhaps more notable the players who have still big question marks over them. Füllkrug, the concept of Füllkrug made me extremely excited because he kind of feels a little bit Mikel Antonio-ish. And say what you want about Antonio, he's been a very effective kind of focal point for our team for over the years. He's just waning now, and he's running. He's flying off to Jamaica fairly frequently, which doesn't help with his fitness. Seeing him in the flesh, I'm concerned because I feel that he needs the game to come to him, which was similar to Sebastian Haller, actually. I can imagine Füllkrug working in a number of different league systems. I'm not sure about the Premier League. Summerville looks really good actually, and I think again that was 20 million pounds. That'll turn out to be decent value. The interesting ones that have barely played, so Guilherme, we signed from Brazil, hasn't got a minute yet, and Todibo, I think that's the one that a lot of people are quite surprised by. He's still being kept out of the team by Bobby Mavropanos,
Mm.
and that's interesting. I was chatting to Tom Williams, who's a frequent guest on the Totally Football show, about him. And he said that really last year he felt like Todibo was starting to look like the complete defender. He was somebody who played previously as a midfielder, and you can see that he's got swagger, he's got strength. And what we've seen in him so far for West Ham has been a bit iffy. He started the cup game against Bournemouth and was taken off at half time after being a little bit too swaggery and being exposed, which I think is fairly ballsy on your English football debut. I think he might be coming into the side over the next couple of weeks if we keep leaking goals. Something's got to change there. Guido Rodriguez, I don't really understand what he does. I think we bought him because we could rather than because we should. He's an Argentinian World Cup winner. Apparently, Barca was sniffing around, but Barca sniff around loads of places these days. He seems to me neither creative nor defensive. He's one of those sort of central midfielders that does a little bit of everything that never seems to work in the Premier League. So yeah, all these signings look fantastic on paper because they always do, before the season has started, and then you actually see what they all look like and how they all fit in, and that's when the questions come.
Yeah, John, Benji talks about Todibo being taken off, after his debut. I'm sure, and I was just looking at some of the stats, there's a few of those players that have been taken. Some of it was taken off again. We're expecting these players to hit the ground running. But as we mentioned earlier, if there isn't a clear fit or a system in place, how on earth do you expect them to shine?
Yeah, I guess that's the question. The question is, what is the system that is being intended to be played here? I think from what I've seen, what we see from Lopetegui is he wants to play a sort of standard 3-2-5 system that a lot of managers try and work these days. Tends to try and do that by pushing his fullbacks on and having one of the centre midfielders dropping. And I guess if we look through the signings, it makes sense. Some of those signings do make sense in terms of what they offer into that kind of system. So, yeah, for example, Max Kilman and Jean-Claire Todibo, regardless of how successful or not Todibo's been so far, they would both fit quite nicely as outside centre backs in that kind of system. Both good, decent at ball progression, and then Niklas Füllkrug, a central figure who and it's worth remembering that the wide players sort of come inside alongside the centre forward. So the idea is that if you can get a sort of target man link up player, then they should be able to play off him quite well. So Niklas Füllkrug makes decent sense in that respect, I would say. Also, Crysensio Summerville in that regard as well. But there are some players where you just think, well, what on earth were they thinking when they brought those in? You already mentioned Guido Rodriguez, but Aaron Wan-Bissaka as well. Benji mentioned him before. Here's a player who is as the trope goes, really good at tackling in defensive transition. Right, it's a very specific skill set. He's being tasked with being one of the wide forwards in that front line of five. They had Aaron Cresswell playing in the second half against Chelsea and getting into decent positions because the system is designed to create space in those wide areas, get the ball through to those players. And neither Cresswell or Wan-Bissaka are particularly well known for being like generative, productive fullbacks. So in some senses, you can see the ideas. In other senses, you can't. And again, part of me thinks whether or not this comes down to what we were talking about before, having lots of different actors and players behind the scenes who have competing interests, so that you look at the transfer window and you can say, well, that's a manager signing, that one's maybe an owner signing, that one's maybe a recruitment team signing, and then again, you're ending up back at the issue that we had before, which is like if you lack that clear identity, then it becomes much harder for everything to be successful. What you need is an owner who brings in a director of football who has a clear idea about what the team should be doing on the field. He then recruits players through the recruitment department to enact those ideals on the pitch. And you have a coach who is then decided to be the guy who's going to bring these players into a point where they're able to bring those things onto the pitch as well. A clear line of identity all the way through the system. And what you see from West Ham seems like there's not quite that strong through line all the way
so
through.
I think it's quite interesting. A bit of a question for John, really, because we've got this director of football in Tim Steidten, who has shown that he is pretty strong in the transfer market. Like, that's fairly indisputable. It doesn't make sense to me as a layman that person should also be brilliant at creating a strategic, tactical identity as well, right? That feels like two jobs. One person defining the style that they want to play and then saying to the transfer guy, go and get me players that fit this style. It doesn't make sense to me that you'd get those two roles mushed into one. Is that kind of what is expected of a modern director of football?
I think so. I don't know if you've read Ian Graham's new book. So Ian Graham was one of the guys at Liverpool in the Klopp era. He's just written a book called How to Win the Premier League. And one of the things he talks about in that book, he talks about the Brendan Rodgers era, which was the beginning really of FSG and their ownership. And what they had in that system was what I'm talking about, these competing interests between actors. So you have Brendan Rodgers on the one. Yeah, they have a transfer committee of like 5 different people, including Brendan Rodgers, and each of those people has a veto when it comes to bringing players in. And what Ian Graham says is that in that season under Brendan Rodgers, the problem is that the recruitment team would veto all of Brendan Rodgers' players that he wanted to bring in, and Brendan Rodgers would veto all of the players that the recruitment team wanted to bring in. And what they ended up doing was bringing in their 6th or 7th choice. So you're ending up with a system where, because you have those competing interests, you end up making worse decisions.
I think on paper, that is what we're supposed to have right now with Tim Steidten. The buck does stop with him. I think whereas Gold and Sullivan, Gold's obviously not around anymore, used to be quite interfering, and it used to be David Sullivan on his Nokia 6210 that was basically doing our entire transfer business. Those days are supposed to have gone. I'm pretty sure they have. The friction we had last year was Moyes versus Steidten, because obviously Steidten hadn't appointed Moyes, and that was sort of crystallised in the James Ward-Prowse transfer, where Steidten didn't want him and Moyes did, and Moyes really put his foot down. I don't think that's happening anymore. I think it is Steidten who is calling the shots. Whether those players necessarily fit what Lopetegui wants, I'm not so sure. Another little thing about Tim Steidten which concerns me is he's very visible. It's not often you get directors of football giving interviews to the BBC after a game. You don't often see them on the pitch, and he comes out on the pitch after most games, right? There are chants about him. West Ham fans love him because he's got all these sexy players, right? I sort of feel like it should be a bit of an egoless role. It shouldn't necessarily be that visible. You want them to be the sort of Svengali behind the scenes.
You've said sexy a few times now, Benji, for West Ham. Here's me thinking you're trying to reshape the branding. But real talk, though, we've spoken about the transfers, and we've spoken about Steinman in particular. West Ham has spent a lot of money this window, 120 odd million, over 120 odd million on transfers. And I'm looking up front for West Ham, and I'm looking at Fulcrook, I'm looking at Mikel Antonio, I'm looking at Danny Ings, players well into their 30s, right? So we're talking a different style of football mentally and how they've developed, but also Rashane put out this wonderful piece, I think it was back in August, and he was talking about, he basically said, since David Sullivan took over in January 2010, West Ham has spent more than £300 million on forwards, and they spent that on more than 50 forwards. I looked down at that list of 50 forwards, the cream of the crop: Sebastian Haller, Andy Carroll, Mikel Antonio, Carlton Cole, Dean Ashton, Jared Bowen, Anatovic, Hernandez, Sacco, Vaz Tay. That's 40 other odd forwards that haven't quite worked. Why are you focusing on players and other parts of the pitch and trying to bolster that when actually goal scoring is still a bit of an issue for West Ham?
Yeah, I mean, it's fair. And that it looks, if Fulcrook turns out not to quite fit either in West Ham style or in the Premier League, that will look like a bit of an aberration. Because the issue with Mikel Antonio is, I think, most managers find him sort of slightly irresistible. Because here is a player who is incredibly hard-working, who creates a lot of space for other players, especially if you've got good wingers. He, unfortunately, technically is relatively poor, but you hope that you put him in there and cause enough chaos factor. that will yield goals from elsewhere, right? And look, Jarrod Bowen got 17 goals last season, not playing as a centre forward. But if Füllkrug doesn't quite seem to fit, and which is my hunch at the moment, if Antonio, he's 34, he's put his body through the ringer for the last decade, right? And he's now playing for Jamaica, every international break. He is on the decline because, of course, he should be at that sort of age. And then Bowen, ultimately, yes, he'll do a job anywhere you put him, but he is not naturally a centre forward. Then yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely, there is a problem there, and it's kind of crazy that we spent all this money without buying someone a little bit more nailed on through the middle.
Yeah, what do you think of that, John? Because another John was linked with West Ham, Mr. John Duran at Aston Villa. Here's me thinking, even someone like Ivan Toney could have been interesting for
big
West Ham to
time. I
look
don't
at.
know why we went in for him. Honestly, I thought Ivan Toney would have been perfect because I think he's a fantastic centre forward that brings others into play. Like, yeah.
In terms of John Duran, yeah, I mean, you look at it now and you think, well, why wasn't everyone in for him? He's just had a fantastic start to the season. One of the best ball strikers that we've seen in Premier League history, which is crazy, right? I have a friend who works for AC Milan in their recruitment department, and his mantra is you can never judge the success of transfers on anything other than the things that we knew at the time that transfer was made. And I think if you apply that logic to John Duran, there's a few things that make me think that I understand why West Ham would go for Füllkrug over Duran. One of them is that Duran obviously had very little. We knew very little about him. He'd had very little top level experience. It would have been very risky and I know he what was it, 5 million more than Füllkrug, and the club decided not to spend it, but. It would have been very risky to bring in an unproven player and expect them to hit the ground running. You need him as your starting striker. What we've seen from Duran this season is him playing back up to one of the best strikers in the Premier League, Ollie Watkins, and that is it's such a fruitful environment for player development, right? Because he comes on late in games against tired legs for a team who have a clear system strategy. He knows what he's doing. There's less pressure on him, and as a result, he's thriving. Were you to throw him in at the deep end with West Ham, there's no saying that development curve would have been exactly the same. So yeah, in hindsight, West Ham fans would be like, yeah, I'd love John Duran. But I think I fully understand why the West Ham recruitment department decided to go for Füllkrug over him at this point.
Okay.
I think that's totally fair. I think it's totally fair, yeah.
Let's look ahead to West Ham's ambitions, and because I feel like this is always a question I come back to you on, Benji. Look, West Ham have hired a former Spanish head coach, Real Madrid manager, very briefly, Europa League winner. What you want to see post Moyes, from my perspective as a fan, is that this is someone that's going to push our club on in terms of quality, but also where we're looking to hit in the Premier League. We all know that top 6 conversation is incredibly tricky. Aston Villa have dipped in. Potentially, we don't know what that looks like. Newcastle have dipped in. They slipped out. Spurs are sort of in and out of that conversation. Do you see West Ham trying to push on with this appointment?
I think that's what they were hoping for. Yeah, I mean, we want to be in Europe. I think that's a really clear ambition, actually, across the club this year. We want to get back into Europe. Any European competition we'd be very happy with. Obviously, we've won one recently. It's hard to say. It looks now as if the job that Lopetegui is being asked to do is really hard. You've got West Ham were in Europe 3 years in a row under David Moyes. That had never happened before. That was unique in our history, right? And then we sort of all decided that's not good enough. We want more, which I think is completely legitimate, by the way. Clubs and fans are absolutely within their rights to say, hey, we want to roll the dice. We want to see if it's possible to do this and get to this level of success, but whilst also playing really interesting, attacking, more modern, contemporary football. So that's what they're looking for, ultimately, Lopetegui. Whether he can achieve it, who knows? The early signs are not good.
Yeah, Benji, I guess the hardest thing about this level of football is time is not a luxury. I'm looking at West Ham's next few fixtures: League Cup away at Liverpool, Brentford away, another London derby, Ipswich at home, Tottenham away, another London derby, and then Manchester United come to West Ham. Ooh la la. Wow. That's oh man. I mean, come on, where do you even start to tweak, let alone how do you start implementing players who aren't even understanding each other?
Yeah, and also a couple of international breaks in the middle of all that. Like, so
Mm,
it's really hard because, as a manager, you're in a new, obviously they're paid the big bucks to do this, but you're
mm,
in a completely new environment, new club, new players. Then you get 4 or 5 players thrown at you at the very end of the transfer window when the season's already started. Then you have an international break after about 10 minutes. And then you get back to
mm,
playing a little bit again. And then you have another international break. Oh, and then there's the League Cup
mm,
in the middle of it all. It's like it's a hard job. Like as you say, the fixtures, no fixtures are simple in the Premier League
mm,
anymore. So and there's in the middle of all that, there is one game that I think we are going to have to hang our hat on, and that's Ipswich at home, right?
mm.
Everything I've said about time and patience and all the caveats around his time at West Ham so far, if we don't win that game, then things start getting a little bit icky. And at that stage, I would even entertain the possibility of maybe cutting our losses, getting rid, and seeing what Graham Potter's up to.
Okay, let's end it there, gents. Thank you so much for your time, Benji, John. That was such an entertaining conversation on West Ham. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.